On our 5th wedding anniversary, I received a phone call. Miss Cordelia, my water just broke. I'm about to give birth. Can you ask Mr. Larken to come over quickly? I really can't reach him. The girl's sobs were particularly piercing in the dark night. The man nestled against my neck froze. He hurriedly got up and dressed. He grabbed the keys on the table and rushed out the door. From beginning to end, he didn't have time to say a word to me or even look at me. I stood there in a daze for a long time. Until I heard the thunder outside. Only then did I realize. The child she was having belonged to my husband. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. Nigel Larken had been very busy with work lately, so busy that he was hardly ever home. My sixth sense kept telling me that something wasn't quite right. I took out my phone and called his secretary Winder. Secretary Winder was young and capable, meticulous and careful in his work. I was the one who personally recruited him into the company back then. I had been a mentor to him. Placing him by Nigel's side was a bit selfish on my part. Nigel had seen through my tricks long ago and would hold me while laughing. What? You placed a spy next to me because you're afraid I'd cheat? I raised an eyebrow. Are you feeling guilty? He caressed my still flat belly and smiled. No way. I wish you could watch me every day. My thoughts returned to the present as Secretary Winder answered the phone. Miss Cordelia, Mr. Larken has indeed been busy with a very important project lately. He's been overwhelmed. But tonight he ordered flowers and bought some jewelry. He just left the office. I was stunned for a moment before realizing it. Today was our 5th wedding anniversary. I dismissed my doubts. I even felt a bit guilty for being so suspicious. Half an hour later, I heard the door open. Nigel came in holding a bouquet of roses in one hand and wrapped an arm around my waist. Happy 5th anniversary, honey. He had reserved a restaurant. After dinner, he proudly took out a necklace. It was the one I had been eyeing for a long time but couldn't bring myself to buy. That night, we were both a bit emotional. 2 years ago, I had a difficult labor and gave birth to a stillborn. The doctor told me I could never get pregnant again, and I was depressed for a long time. After taking medication and undergoing treatment, I finally felt better this year. Nigel had set his phone to silent in the car. He said he didn't want work to disturb us. As soon as we got home, before we even reached the bedroom, he started kissing me. Afterwards, he smoked a cigarette and went to shower. When he came out, he cuddled me like a giant puppy. The phone by the pillow suddenly rang. It was Nigel's assistant, Effie. She joined the company shortly after I got pregnant. The young girl was beautiful. Though she had just graduated from college, she was very capable and always sweetly called me Miss Cordelia. Nigel liked her a lot. He said, there are so many social engagements now. Having a sweet-talking young girl around makes things easier with those bosses. At first, I didn't say anything. But later, probably due to pregnancy hormones, I found her increasingly annoying and had a fight with Nigel over it. Nigel had no choice but to let her go to appease me. Why was she calling so late? After some hesitation, I pressed the answer button. Hello. Her breath was rapid. Miss Cordelia, my water just broke. I'm about to give birth. Can you ask Mr. Larken to come over quickly? I really can't reach him. I know it's your wedding anniversary today, and I shouldn't be disturbing you, but could you please tell him? It's okay if I die, but this child is his. The girl's sobs were particularly piercing in the dark night. The man nestled against my neck froze and hurriedly got up. He was so flustered that he stumbled as he got out of bed. He hastily put on some clothes, grabbed the keys on the table, then picked up his phone, dialing as he ran out. Don't be afraid, I'm coming right now. I stared at Nigel's departing figure. Stared at the door he left ajar, in a daze for a long time. It wasn't until I heard the thunder outside that I snapped back to reality. There were still traces of him on the bed. The scent of his body wash still lingered in the bathroom. I hadn't even fully emerged from the tenderness and affection of moments ago, and he was already rushing to another woman, and their child. It was too sudden. It was really too sudden. The sky was about to brighten, and I took a taxi to the hospital. I didn't know which one it was, so I went around all the nearby hospitals. Finally, I saw Nigel's back at the entrance of the delivery room of the hospital where I had given birth before. He was pacing back and forth anxiously. When he saw the doctor come out of the operating room, he rushed up immediately. "How is she?" The doctor handed him the baby. "Don't worry, mother and child are safe." He breathed a sigh of relief, leaned against the wall, and played with the baby in his arms. His face was full of a satisfied smile. But the moment he saw me, his smile froze. Panic flashed in his eyes. He wanted to walk towards me, but the mother was pushed out. Effie's weak hand grabbed his clothes. "Don't go, I'm scared." He gently patted Effie's hand. "Don't worry." Then, without any hesitation, he turned and followed her back to the ward. It seemed that they were the real family. And I was just a voyeur. When I left the hospital, it was drizzling outside. I didn't use an umbrella. I walked aimlessly along the roadside. A taxi stopped beside me, honking. "Miss, where are you going? Do you need a ride?" I got into the car and gave an address. The taxi stopped in a slum area. I walked to the third floor with familiarity. I took the key from a dried-up flower pot and opened the door to go in. Nigel and I came to the capital to strive after graduating from university at 23. Neither of our parents could help much. The money we had in our pockets together was just over $2,000. After much selection, we rented a small house in the suburbs. There was no separate kitchen, no living room. The only good thing was an independent toilet. In the square room, apart from a table, there was just a small bed. Turning over in bed would make creaking sounds. In winter, the windows leaked air, and we were reluctant to use the electric heater, so we huddled together under the quilt to keep warm. We treated a sweet potato as a treasure, taking turns to eat it. The hardest times were actually the times we loved the most. We lived here for 3 years. Every month when we got our salary, I would add something to the house to make it look cozier. At that time, Nigel was running business. He said, "We won't live in this place for long, no need to decorate it so carefully. When this project is done, and we get the final payment, we can move into a better neighborhood." At 26, the business turned around, and life got better and better. We got our marriage certificate and moved into a better house. He started his own company. I quit my job to help him. I managed accounts, worked as an assistant, secretary, logistics, and even did some cleaning work part-time. The company grew bigger and bigger. We had our own home in the capital. After achieving complete financial freedom, I didn't tell Nigel that I bought this rental house. Every brick, every tile, every plant, and every tree remained the same. I hugged my knees and sat on the sofa, looking at the photo in front of me. That was us at 18, agreeing to get into the same university and confirming our relationship. Our faces were full of youthful joy and longing for the future. Counting the time, from 18 to now, we have been together for 13 years. 13 years. I suddenly laughed. Then buried my head and cried uncontrollably. The phone rang, piercingly loud. I didn't answer. Then the second, the third. I directly put it on silent. Finally, Nigel sent a message. "Where are you? I'll come to pick you up, let's talk." After crying enough, I wiped my tears. But looking at the chat box, my eyes started to sting again. I scrolled up through the chat history. Nigel reminded me to eat, to take my medicine on time, sharing beautiful sceneries, nice songs. Until last year, his messages gradually decreased. Most of them were saying, "Busy with work, I won't be back for dinner tonight, don't wait for me." Or, "I have to go on a business trip, take good care of yourself at home." But I didn't notice at all. Tears fell on the phone screen. I blinked while replying to his message, "I'll be home tomorrow night." Early the next morning, I contacted a realtor to list the house. I was worried it was too old to sell well. The realtor said, "Don't worry about that. There are plenty of poor people. And besides, with the price you're offering, it'll definitely be in demand." I smiled but didn't say anything. At 6 in the evening, I called Secretary Winder to come pick me up. Sitting in the car, I watched the diverse crowd outside the window. I spoke softly. Winder, do you know about Nigel and that young woman? His hand on the steering wheel visibly stiffened, and he glanced at me secretly. Miss Cordelia, what young woman? I turned to look at him. Effie. His eyes flickered. I continued. Back then, when your mother was hospitalized, I paid for her surgery. It was also my recommendation that got you into Larken Group as a secretary. There's a saying that you should always remember those who helped you. Winder, do you think Nigel is your only boss and that I can't touch you? The drive from the suburbs to home took about 2 hours. On the way, Secretary Winder clarified the timeline of Nigel's affair. When Effie first joined the company, she was restless and repeatedly tried to seduce Nigel. Eventually, after a drunken night, Nigel fell for it, but they didn't cross the final line. Until I asked him to fire Effie. One night, Effie went to find Nigel crying, and they stayed in the office for a long time. When they came out, Effie's face was flushed. Secretary Winder immediately knew what had happened. Nigel gave him a few warnings, and he didn't dare tell me. That was the first time. Later, when I had a difficult childbirth and couldn't have children, my emotions were extremely unstable. They had a second and third time. Until Effie got pregnant. Nigel had Secretary Winder buy a house outside for Effie to rest and occasionally went to accompany her. Secretary Winder had been lying to me all along. The two of them were colluding to deceive me. And at that time, I was drowning in the pain of losing my child. It turned out that every time Nigel worked late, he was with Effie. I clenched my fists, trembling with anger. The car stopped in the basement. Secretary Winder knelt down and cowed out to me, Miss Cordelia, I really had no choice. Both of you are difficult to offend, and I'm caught in the middle, suffering on both sides. Maybe you can hit me a few times to vent your anger. I took a deep breath. Did you keep any evidence? He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I took out the recording pen I had just used in the car. Help me with something. Otherwise, I'll let Nigel hear this recording, and then you'll be offending both sides and won't get any benefit. Don't worry, help me with this, and once it's done, I'll arrange a good place for you. By the time I got home, I had already adjusted my emotions. Only a dim lamp was lit in the living room. Nigel was sitting on the sofa with a bottle of white wine in front of him, already more than half drunk. I changed into my slippers and took off my scarf as usual, asking him, why didn't you turn on the heater? His cheeks were unnaturally red. After all these years, his alcohol tolerance was still terrible. Oh, right, you're afraid of the cold. Saying so, he staggered to his feet and turned on the air conditioning. We sat facing each other. After a long silence, I spoke first. Go ahead. After a long preparation, he said, I'm sorry, Cordy. I really want a child. I was smiling, but my eyes were filled with tears, and I asked, and then? Are you planning to divorce me and marry Effie? Or do you want me to be a mother to your child? He lowered his head and said nothing. Both answers would benefit him. He was testing my tolerance. Perhaps he was still calculating how to have the best of both worlds. How ridiculous. The man I loved for 13 years was such a scoundrel. I cupped his face gently. Do you remember why I had a difficult childbirth 2 years ago? A flash of pain crossed his eyes, and his eyes gradually turned red. Cordy, it's all in the past. Don't bring it up again. I can't get over it. I interrupted him loudly, tears streaming down my face, losing control of my emotions again. I can never get over it. You can easily say you want a child, but what about me? What about me? Back then, Nigel and I had been working hard in the capital for many years and finally settled down. At 28, I thought about having a child. But I couldn't get pregnant. After a checkup at the hospital, the doctor said I had endometrial damage. The reason was that I had an abortion once before due to unstable economic conditions. The doctor comforted me, saying not to worry, to take good care of my body, and that there would still be a chance. Nigel also said it was okay, that being child-free was fine too. If I really liked children, we could adopt one. He said that, but who wouldn't want their own child? Moreover, Nigel and I were so in love at that time. Heaven smiled on us, and one morning a year later, I realized I had missed my period the previous month. I casually took a test. 2 lines. I was pregnant. I was stunned for a long time. Crying, I called Nigel. He was in G-City negotiating a project at the time. Upon hearing the news, he immediately put down his work and took the time to fly back to see me. He stayed with me for 3 hours, then rushed back overnight. Since then, I gradually stopped asking about the company's affairs and stayed at home to take care of my pregnancy. Until a problem arose with one of the company's accounts. There was a shortfall of tens of millions, and we couldn't come up with the money in a short time. Nigel was overwhelmed, unable to sleep night after night. He was afraid I would worry, so he kept it from me. I found out when my phone ran out of battery, and I used his phone to send a message to my mom and saw his chat records with Secretary Winder. Only then did I know that the company was in such trouble. I suddenly remembered a friend I met when the business was just starting. He was wealthy and generous, with the surname Punter. In desperation, I called him to discuss the interest on a loan. He readily agreed, claiming he could lend the money. What I didn't expect was that he was a beast. He had special preferences. That day, I smashed his head, leaving a bloody wound, and scratched his face. When Nigel arrived with the police, I was lying on broken porcelain, blood flowing from between my legs. I was already 8 months pregnant. He was terrified and carried me to the hospital. I had a difficult labor and hemorrhaged, barely surviving. The baby was fully formed. It was a boy. I took one look at him. He was healthy, seemingly just asleep. The doctor said I would never have the chance to get pregnant again. I didn't cry. Nigel cried a lot. That Mr. Punter was detained. The hotel provided surveillance footage, ensuring that if we sued him, we would definitely win. Mr. Punter's parents came to the hospital to beg me. Their family was very wealthy, extremely wealthy, so even if I pursued it, he would only be sentenced to a few years. But for the sake of the company Nigel and I had worked so hard to build, I didn't want to see it all go to waste. So I asked for a large sum of money. Nigel and I had a big argument. He swore and smashed the vase by the hospital bed in anger. The last time we fought this fiercely was when we decided to have the abortion. We had just moved to a new house then, and the business was in its early stages, with everything unstable. We couldn't afford to be distracted by a child. Nigel didn't want me to abort the child. He said we could send the child to my mom's to take care of for a while. I disagreed. I always believed that if you were going to have a child, you should give them the best environment and the best companionship. If I couldn't do that, I would rather not have one. I insisted on scheduling the surgery. After the abortion, we gave each other the cold shoulder for nearly a month. Nigel called me selfish. Called me mercenary. Called me someone who only cares about money, willing to throw away even my dignity. He made such a scene that the room next door complained. A nurse came over and persuaded him to leave. After he left, I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. I cried myself to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, sitting on the bed, absent-mindedly touching my belly. The door was gently opened. Nigel tiptoed in. Our eyes met. He lowered his head, walked up to me, and gently hugged me. Choking with emotion, he said, "I'm sorry, honey. It's all my fault. I'm the one to blame. I couldn't protect you and our child." That night, we held each other and cried. We thought we would be each other's support for life. In the 2 years after losing the child, I was in so much pain I almost wanted to die, relying on medication to ease the symptoms every day. Nigel had already gotten involved with another woman. While he was being perfunctory with me, he was whispering sweet nothings to other women. Pulling myself out of the memories, I looked at Nigel. Nigel avoided my gaze. "I'm sorry, Cordelia." Another apology. Why is it always an apology? This house is yours, and we'll split the property equally. If you want to return to the company, I'll always keep a position for you. If you don't want to, you'll still get your annual dividends. Getting to this point isn't entirely my fault. Cordelia, you're too stubborn, you never consider my feelings from my perspective. So let's part ways amicably. After saying that, he stood up and didn't look at me again. The sound of the door closing echoed. So, he never intended to keep me. From the beginning, he had planned to divorce me. I was just being foolishly sentimental. I thought, after so many years of feelings, he would find it hard to let go. But in the end, it was all my fault. I didn't care about his feelings? How ridiculous. It's really too ridiculous. Tears rolled down my face. I grabbed the cup on the coffee table and, in a fit of rage, threw it at the wedding photo hanging in the center of the living room. The glass shattered instantly. I wished I could erase all traces of him. It seemed like I was having another episode, feeling as if there were cat claws scratching at me. I picked up the broken glass from the floor and cut myself with it. After a few cuts and seeing blood, I regained clarity. I took a few pills from the table and finally calmed down. I arranged a time with Nigel to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau to handle the divorce procedures. The two of us waited for our number to be called. Then we quietly sat in front of the staff and answered questions. The divorce cooling-off period requires 1 month. We divided our assets. I didn't want the company's shares and exchanged everything for money. Nigel was straightforward. As soon as the cooling-off period ended, we got the certificate in the morning, and the money was transferred in the afternoon. He was probably in a hurry to get the certificate with Effie. The house we bought in the capital was very large. We initially planned to have a son and a daughter, including rooms for the nanny, childcare teacher, and guest rooms. I said at the time that the house was too big and unnecessary. Nigel insisted. And the result? In the end, it wasn't fully occupied, leaving only me alone. The new year was approaching. I had mentioned to my mom that I was going to divorce Nigel. She was hesitant, wanting to speak but stopping herself. In the end, she said, "You're grown up, I won't interfere." Then she angrily hung up the phone. Over the years since I left, she indeed didn't interfere with me. Except when she reached out to ask for money, showing some perfunctory concern, there was nothing else. To be honest, she hasn't been a very qualified mother. My dad passed away early when I was young. She never worked a day in her life, and after my dad's death, she remarried. The man was fine at first. He treated my mom well and treated me well too. Later, my mom gave birth to my sister but couldn't give him a son, and his temperament changed drastically, starting to abuse us. He couldn't bear to hit his own daughter, so he hit me. Once, he kicked me hard. It happened to be during my period, and with that kick, I almost bled uncontrollably. I was in the hospital for 7 days before I recovered. My mom was terrified and insisted on divorcing him. Sometimes I think she is very contradictory. Sometimes she seems to love me a lot, and sometimes it seems she only loves herself. After the divorce, with the lesson from last time, she was afraid my sister and I would suffer again, so she didn't remarry. Instead, she took us back to my grandmother's house and started working in a factory. I was 16 that year, just starting high school. It was then that I met Nigel Larken. We were desk mates. He was very shy and didn't take the initiative to talk to me much throughout the semester. Until the second year, when we were about to change classes. I was good at both liberal arts and science, and I was torn about which to choose. One day during a break, Nigel, who had just finished playing basketball, suddenly appeared in front of me. It was a bit stuffy in the summer, but a breeze blew in the afternoon. The wind rustled the leaves of the sycamore trees. Sunlight shone on the boy's hair, giving it a golden hue. He held a basketball in one hand and leaned on the door frame with the other. Blushing, he bent down and looked at me. "Cordelia, are you choosing liberal arts or science?" I was a bit stunned. Science, I guess. A decision I hadn't made suddenly became clear at that moment. He smiled. "Then I'll choose science too." "Can we still be desk mates?" Someone not far away was teasing. I blushed too, lowering my head in embarrassment. Sure. Later, Nigel's family moved to a house near the school to make it easier for him to study. It was also quite close to my house, just around the corner. He often waited for me to go to school together. Every time I passed that corner, I could always see him standing in the morning sun, smiling at me, waving with breakfast in his hand. Nigel's father died in a car accident a few years ago. Now, only his grandmother is left at home. The elderly lady's health is not very good and she has been staying in the hospital. Nigel was afraid his grandmother couldn't handle the news of our divorce all at once and asked me to keep it from her for now. I didn't refuse. After all, his grandmother treated me very well, and I didn't want to see the elderly lady get upset and have an accident. What a coincidence. The day before I went home, the house I had in the suburbs was sold. It was bought by a young couple who had just moved to the capital to start their careers. They didn't mind that it was small and seemed very satisfied. The girl held the young man's hand and said, "Look, there's even a bathroom here. We won't have to share a bathroom with others anymore. We can avoid being late for work and sleep a bit longer in the morning." As she spoke, the girl glanced at me shyly and said in a low voice, "Miss Cordelia, we just graduated and recently found jobs. We don't have much savings. Could you lower the price a bit?" I smiled and didn't hesitate. "Sure." The next day, Secretary Winder drove me to the airport. I sat in the back seat, resting with my eyes closed. "Is everything taken care of?" "Yes, I sent it to your phone." He then cautiously glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "Do you really want to do this?" I smiled. If he can let go, why can't I? After leaving the airport, I took a train to get home. My sister was busy cooking. My mom was sleeping in her room. She didn't come out for dinner either. My sister sighed. "She's been like this since the last time you talked on the phone." I asked her what's wrong, but she wouldn't tell me. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. I pushed the door open. "Mom." She replied sarcastically, "You still consider me your mom? You decided on such a big thing as divorce all by yourself without discussing it with me." Sitting up, she continued, "Nigel has been so good to you. You've known each other since childhood, went to school together, worked together, and now your life is going so well. What's so hard to talk about that you have to get a divorce? Do you forget that during the earthquake, if it hadn't been for him, you—" "Mom." I interrupted her before she could finish. She stopped talking and turned her back to me to show her discontent. I sighed. Nigel cheated. He had a child with another woman. If you're worried that I'll have no money to support you after the divorce, there's no need. I've never relied on him to support me. My mom's back stiffened. I turned and went out, sat at the dining table, and started eating. My sister looked at me with concern. "Sis." I smiled and put some food in her bowl. "All right, let's eat." In the days leading up to the new year, I often come to the hospital to accompany Grandma. She is getting old and her memory is very poor. Sometimes she remembers me, and sometimes she chases after me, asking who I am. As I peel an apple, I answer patiently, "Grandma, it's me, Cordy." She stared at me for a while, then a smile appeared on her face. "Cordy, what time is it? Why aren't you at school?" After she said that, she suddenly remembered something and started pacing back and forth in the ward, muttering, "Where's Nigel?" I sighed. I stood up, just about to help her sit down. The door to the ward was pushed open. Nigel appeared in front of me, panting. Grandma was stunned and walked over to look at him. After a long time, she recognized him. "You're back. Cordy came to find you to play." Nigel frowned, guilt flashing in his eyes. "Grandma." In the years of starting the business, we had neglected Grandma. She refused to come with us to the capital and stayed in the nursing home. Last year, she fell while taking a walk and was sent to the hospital. Since then, she began to forget things and people. At that time, I was also in poor health and couldn't leave the company. My mom and my sister had been taking care of Grandma. Nigel dragged me out of the ward. In the hospital stairwell, he lowered his voice and said, "Didn't we agree to part amicably? Cordelia, what are you doing? Trying to get revenge on me? Trying to ruin me?" I continued to smile, looking up at him. "Yes. You said we should part amicably. I never agreed to that." I contacted the media and spread evidence of his affair all over the internet. As a result, the company's stock plummeted. Additionally, Secretary Winder jumped ship to the rival company. Shortly after he started, he snatched a project that Nigel was negotiating, causing the company significant losses. Some netizens dug up Effie's current address and her parents' and relatives' contact information. The overwhelming abuse made everyone miserable. Nigel said that Effie almost committed suicide because of this. He accused me. "Cordelia, how did you become so vicious? That child is so young, do you really want her to lose her mother? You were a mother too. I was so angry that my whole body trembled, and I slapped him. He finally shut up. I thought I wouldn't shed any more tears for Nigel. I thought after crying so many times these days, my tears would have dried up. But at this moment, my eyes were unbearably sore. Effie appeared out of nowhere, standing in front of Nigel, crying her eyes out. Miss Cordelia, I know you hate me, blame me, please don't. Before she could finish, I slapped Effie. Who do you think you are, to talk to me? Effie bit her lip, her cheek swollen, eyes red. Nigel was anxious, raising his arm as if to hit back. But in the end, he didn't. He said, Cordelia, you're ruthless enough. Then he left, protecting Effie. When my sister came to find me, she just happened to brush past them. She felt indignant on my behalf and said, that's the person he's having an affair with, how shameless. Nigel Larken is such a good actor, pretending to be so affectionate. For over 10 years, I've considered him a model for a husband. In fact, he wasn't really acting. When he loved, it was genuine, and when he stopped loving, that was genuine too. After all, every stage of life has different needs. Most young people at 18 or 19 believe in true love above all else. They think love can conquer everything. I still remember after the college entrance exams, we had an earthquake here. That day, Nigel and I had just confirmed our relationship and planned to go see a movie together. Before the movie ended, the ground started shaking. People could hardly stand. Running wasn't fast enough. When the buildings began to collapse, he shielded me with his body. I don't know how long it was, but when I woke up, I felt something warm dripping on my face. When I opened my eyes, I realized it was Nigel's blood. Maybe his head had been hit. I cried in fear. I pushed his chest, Nigel. Nigel. It was very quiet all around. So quiet it made people anxious. After a while, the person lying on me took a breath and said hoarsely, I'm still alive, don't cry yet. I clutched his shirt. What should we do? I'm so scared. Someone will come to rescue us. I'm worried about my grandmother, sister, and mother. And your parents and grandmother. He comforted me, everything will be all right. I asked again, what if we die? Then I'll come find you in the next life, and we'll meet earlier. In that earthquake, I lost my grandmother. Nigel also lost his mother. When I came to my senses, I stared blankly at the ceiling. Unable to sleep, I picked up the medicine bottle and poured out a few pills. My mom happened to come in and saw the scene. She rushed over, held me down, and threw the pills out of my hand. Do you want to die? Being so pathetic over a man. She pinched my cheeks, trying to make me spit out the pills. Are there any left in your mouth? I said with difficulty, I don't want to die, I just can't sleep. These are sleeping pills. We locked eyes. She looked a bit embarrassed. Slowly, she pulled back her hand and sat by my bed. The wind started blowing at night. The house had no soundproofing at all. After a while, my mom said, just get a divorce. You're only 30, there's a long road ahead. I'll find you someone good in the future. I'm still waiting to hold my grandchild. I interrupted her, Mom, I'm sick. I can't have children. She paused for a moment and looked back at me. I lay in bed, covering my face with the blanket. I don't know when my mom left. Maybe she sat by my bed all night. Because I have a habit of kicking off the blanket. But when I woke up this morning, the blanket hadn't moved at all. Thinking of what happened yesterday and what Nigel said, I felt nauseous. Physically nauseous. My phone rang a few times. It was Nigel's biggest rival in business, Simon Marson. Secretary Winder was the one I recommended to him. I answered wearily, hello. The collaboration you mentioned before, I've thought about it. Can we discuss it in person? I'm not in the capital right now. He interrupted me, I know, I just got off the plane. Give me an address, I'll come to you. Simon Marson acted quickly. At 3 in the afternoon, we met at a cafe. He smiled, I thought you were joking with me before. Simon is very cautious. I had contacted him before divorcing Nigel, wanting to collaborate and bring down the Larken group. At that time, his shrewd eyes scrutinized me. He smiled and said, "Mrs. Larken, you and your husband aren't playing me, are you?" So I sent Secretary Winder over to him. With Secretary Winder's help, Simon intercepted a big deal Nigel was about to close. Only then did Simon let down his guard towards me. I took out the prepared documents and contract from my bag. These are internal company documents, along with some ongoing projects. I have no other demands. After it's done, you take 70%, I take 30%. Mr. Marson, it's not too much for me to get some benefits, right? Not at all, of course not. Without hesitation, Simon signed the contract, a smug look on his face. Nigel Larken brought this on himself. He really deserves it. After saying that, he stood up. Cordelia, happy cooperation. Mr. Marson, happy cooperation. I've never been one to endure. From the moment I found out about Nigel's affair, I never thought of letting him off. I'd rather both of us get hurt than part ways amicably, as he suggested. New Year's Eve. Nigel brought his grandmother home for the holiday. After dinner, the elderly woman went to bed early. Nigel sat in the living room, holding an emergency meeting with the shareholders. Halfway through the meeting, he got so angry that he smashed his computer. Effie approached him with concern. "What's going on?" Nigel pinched the bridge of his nose. "The company's stock is still falling. The projects we were discussing earlier have all fallen through. They say Simon Marson's conditions are better and want to reconsider." Effie panicked. "What should we do?" Nigel clenched his fists. "Cordelia, it's Cordelia again. When we got divorced, she agreed so readily, but behind my back, she's been sabotaging me. I've been good to her all these years. With her temper, anyone else would have divorced her long ago." Nigel, in his anger, forgot there was an elderly person at home. His grandmother was awakened by the noise and heard everything clearly. She shakily came out of her room, pointing at Nigel. "You divorced Cordy? You bastard!" She picked up her cane and hit Nigel. "When you had nothing, Cordy married you without asking for a house or a dowry. Now that you're successful, you..." Effie tried to intervene. His grandmother pointed at her. "Is this the mistress you found outside? You lied to me, and dared to say she was your assistant." In the struggle between the three, his grandmother clutched her chest and fell to the ground. The hospital called my mother, saying Grandma had fainted and was in a bad condition. When we arrived, Nigel and Effie were at the door of the operating room. We waited for about half an hour. The doctor came out, shaking his head. "The patient is old and couldn't handle the shock. We've done our best." Then, Grandma's body was pushed out. Effie was terrified. Nigel's eyes were red, and he slapped himself hard. After a while, he turned to stare at me. "Cordelia, are you satisfied now?" Why hadn't I noticed before how good he was at shirking responsibility? To deal with the company's mess, Nigel hurried back to the capital the day after the funeral. When I saw news about him in the media again, it was more than half a month later. After losing several projects in a row, the shareholders became dissatisfied and began to withdraw their shares. A reporter went to interview him, and in the footage, Nigel looked disheveled and extremely dejected. He looked like he had aged 10 years. Effie came to see me. She begged me to help the company through the crisis with my money. I couldn't help but laugh. Why should I? "Cordelia, the company is also your hard work. You don't want it to collapse, do you? I know you're angry with me. I can apologize, I can kneel and kowtow to you, I can even die, as long as you help Nigel." I kept a cold face. People have to bear the consequences of their mistakes. I have no reason to cover for you too. "Miss Effie, if you come to me again, I'll call the police." Her face turned unpleasant. People were already gathering around, pointing and whispering. Effie stood up shakily. Fine. "Cordelia, you're forcing me." As soon as she finished speaking, she slammed her head against the wall. Bright red blood trickled down her cheek. A woman rushed forward to hold Effie. "Oh, my daughter, you just had a baby and now you're being forced to die. What will happen to the baby if you die?" At the same time, a group of photographers appeared, frantically taking pictures of me. I instinctively closed my eyes and raised my hand to block. A microphone was shoved in my face. Someone asked, "Miss Cordelia, did you set up your ex-husband to ruin him and threaten his current wife to die so you could take the opportunity to get back together? Is this true? Is it true that you can't get pregnant because you were assaulted during pregnancy? Please answer." I was a bit stunned. Still in shock from Effie hitting the wall, I hadn't recovered my senses. A buzzing sound filled my ears. A feeling of suffocation slowly crept in. My sister squeezed through the crowd and held me tightly. My mother came out with a kitchen knife. "Get out. All of you, get out." Effie's mother originally wanted to extort some money from me, but I sent her to the police station on the grounds of spreading rumors and causing trouble. Effie was taken to the hospital by ambulance. Nothing serious, just a few bandages. But her mental state seemed a bit off. She kept insisting on seeing me. I didn't see her, thinking it was bad luck. That night, Nigel rushed over. When I was buying soy sauce at the supermarket, he blocked me on the road, saying he wanted to talk to me again. He lowered his head. "I know you and Simon Marson teamed up to bring me down. It was my fault first, and I don't blame you for doing this. But for the sake of our years of hard work together, can you let it go? Consider it. I'm begging you." I laughed. "You can't bear the consequences now, so you want to gamble on whether I'll soften up? Nigel Larken, you should beg Simon Marson. It might work better than begging me. He might even give you a way out. For example, letting you work as a security guard for him or something." Nigel looked embarrassed. "Cordelia, is it really necessary to go this far? Do you really want to see me die?" I blurted out, "Fine, go die then." We locked eyes. I spoke coldly. "From the moment you cheated, I've been wishing you would die. Do you think threatening me like this will work?" He remained silent. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. Nigel and I parted ways unpleasantly. The next time I heard about him was from my best friend. She said Nigel Larken went bankrupt. The Larken Group's building was bought by Simon Marson. She also said Nigel's child was diagnosed with congenital heart disease, and now money is being spent like water. I subconsciously asked, "What about Effie?" She probably ran away. Otherwise, do you expect her to stick with Nigel through thick and thin? Serves him right. After hanging up the phone, I still felt a bit dazed. After coming back to my senses, I continued walking home. The moonlight stretched my shadow long. Further ahead, I would pass that narrow alley and familiar corner. 17-year-old Nigel used to wait there with breakfast for me. The initial excitement and love were so genuine. The later hurt was equally deep. But life must start a new chapter. Those pains should stay in the past. And I must keep moving forward. After staying at home for almost a whole year, I decided to go abroad for further studies. 3 years later, I returned to my homeland, receiving numerous job offers from various companies. I chose a position that I both liked and was good at, and it didn't require too much effort. Although the salary wasn't substantial, it was enough to keep me from being overworked. In my spare time, I could still find time to travel around. One day, while out dining with friends, I happened to catch a glimpse of a familiar face. It was Nigel Larken. He was driving for someone else. It seemed he felt my gaze because he looked up at me. Our eyes met. He deliberately avoided my gaze. My friend noticed my reaction and gently patted my shoulder, asking, "Do you know him?" I nodded. "Are you close?" I smiled and shook my head, "Just someone insignificant."